Okay, dear Venerable brothers, Venerable sisters and Dhamma friends. So we are going to start the first Dhamma sermon of this residential retreat conducted at Nissarana Vanaya. This is the 315th retreat. May you give your consent by saying Sadhu Sadhu. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Samadhim bhikkave bhaveta samahito bhikkave yatha bhutang pajanati ti. Dear Venerable brothers, Venerable sisters and Dhamma friends. So typically at the beginning of any retreat, we typically mention few things. I thought of discussing that today as well. So that is basically about the 5 supports. So whenever we are conducting a retreat, that we are reminding those 5 supports. Those are available, actually mentioned in the Anuggahita Sutta. And the first support is nothing but the sila, the morality. So that's why all of you are very much concerned about it. You have too little concern about it. That's why we have given 8 precepts today, so that we are in a way uplifting our morality. There may be various mistakes that we have done. There are various offenses we have conducted due to our certain amount of defilements. But now onwards, we are trying our best to adhere to the morality as much as possible. Honestly, humbly, we are trying to protect our sila. So that is quite important, as it is giving a fairly conducive environment in our mind. Because right now we are dealing with our mind, we are trying to develop our mind. But if the atmosphere within ourselves is very much like negative, telling that we are wrong, that I have done various mistakes, various offenses, my sila has these issues, and then it is quite difficult for us to have a very positive atmosphere, very joyful atmosphere, particularly within ourselves. But on the other hand, even if we have done various other mistakes, but still we have forgiven ourselves and made a certain determination. Yes, I have done various mistakes, but now onwards I am trying my best to adhere to the precepts as much as possible to maintain the morality. If we take such kind of a resolution, if we make such kind of a determination honestly, that will really help us, because it will give a what we call as a feeling that I am a good person now. At least I am now trying to be a good person. As I mentioned, everybody do mistakes, but now onwards I am making a determination to be good, to be a sappurisa, a good person. So that establishing ourselves in that Samadhi, what we call as the mundane type of Samadhi, Kammassakata Samadhi, we can recognize as the first stage. And when we are doing that, it gives us a very joyful mentality in ourselves. Then that actually leads to further development. That peaceful, joyful environment within ourselves is very, very important. Otherwise, we can't actually even go to the next step. So sila, morality, in that sense is very important. It is not that we are trying to show off that I am the best person or the best in the morality. Rather, we are just trying to honestly, humbly maintain our precepts so that it is helping us to develop further in our spiritual path. And second, as Buddha mentioned, is what we call as the Sutta Anuggahita, where we are maintaining certain amount of clarity about the Buddha's teaching. So that's what we are trying to do. So we are referring various suttas, ancient teaching conducted by the Buddha. It is not our own type of path that we are trying to develop. Rather, our practice has to be well aligned with the Buddha's teaching. So that's why we are referring various suttas and trying to get certain amount of guidance from that suttas. That is very, very important, because nowadays there are various ad hoc methods being discussed all around the world. But what we are trying to do is, as much as possible, get some light from the Buddha's ancient teaching. So we typically call it as the early Buddhist teachings. So early Buddhist teaching is what we are giving more prominence, and therefore even the Sutta discussions are very much based on the early Buddhist teachings, not much with respect to the commentaries and other commentaries, but fairly with respect to the canon. And it is not just a single sutta, but there are various suttas that we may time to time take forward so that we can get certain amount of guidance. And having thorough understanding about the suttas, thorough understanding about the Buddha's teaching is quite important, because it will help us to overcome many doubts in ourselves as well as various doubts coming from outside. Because sometimes people talk many different aspects, and sometimes their own findings, and sometimes maybe wrong views as well. On such situation, if we are not confident in what we know and about the Buddha's teaching, if we do have a certain amount of doubts, then we also get into kind of a perplexity. To avoid that, we need fair amount of thorough understanding about the Buddha's teaching, particularly about the suttas. And here actually we are not discussing too much about Vinaya and all the other things, but rather whatever relevant to our practice. Typically we are taking a particular theme to this meditation retreat, and according to that theme we are taking various relevant suttas, and we are trying to get certain amount of guidance. And that guidance will help us to align our practice. So it's a kind of reflection. So what Buddha has mentioned, how we are doing, what I have achieved or what I have understood, is it also aligned with the Buddha's teaching? So that we can make certain amount of adjustments in case we have gone into wrong direction. Because there's a possibility in that as well. Because we can't say immediately I am having the best kind of understanding. So that is why the next support, next anuggahita, sakacca anuggahita is important. Whether my understanding and the Buddha's teaching is the correct, is it 100% aligned? So that also we need to further discuss. So that is why we are trying to discuss as a open discussion during the question and answer session. So during our practice, we are trying to adhere to the Buddha's teaching, and accordingly we are practicing. And what we understood, what we experientially understood, now we are trying to tally with the Buddha's teaching, so that we know that we are not going astray, rather we are fairly in line with what Buddha is talking. And on the other hand, by listening to these discussions particularly, there are many others also going to be benefited. Because we know that some person can't actually understand or write properly, so because they may have certain amount of difficulties in answering questions or properly expressing their difficulties. On such situation, actually when we hear someone else's quite precise, elaborative explanation, that help us also to understand what's really going on. And on the other hand, by looking at certain reports, we ourselves get inspiration. Because when someone is talking by their own experience, how they work hard and how they have faced certain problems, how they overcome them. So likewise, when we are listening to them, we also get a lot of inspiration. Yes, this can be done. It is not something obsolete. Rather, this is possible even today. So likewise, we get a fair amount of inspiration by even listening to someone else's reports. So that is also another thing why we are conducting this open discussion. So there is nothing to hide here. Even though we individually do the practice, very much the development is fairly very common. Our human mind is fairly equal, fairly consistent in that sense. So what we are developing is a same kind of Dhamma within ourselves. So open discussion in that sense help us to inspire ourselves. And we ourselves also, if we do a kind of analysis, so how my previous report compared to today's report. So likewise, I can get a kind of an idea whether am I going in the correct direction, whether there is a improvement in my practice. So likewise, these reports are helpful in that sense as well. So open discussion on the other hand would be helpful to overcome doubts, because whether my understanding is true or not, actually if I can discuss with certain teachers and other practitioners during the discussion time, not every time, so that will be helpful, so that I am also aligned with the others, with the teacher or with the teaching of the Buddha. So then I have no doubts. Then I can wholeheartedly practice. Because one thing is, if I have certain doubts about the practice, then I am not putting 100% into the practice. I make certain reservations without putting 100%, not practicing wholeheartedly, because I have doubts about the method, or I have doubts about the teacher, or my own understanding. So these doubts are quite difficult in that sense, are like barriers. So overcoming doubts, in order to overcome doubts, so this open discussion, kind of honest discussion, is quite helpful. And the discussion will be fairly factual. It is not that we are talking in an ad hoc way, but it has to be always in line with the Buddha's teaching. And one thing actually I like to highlight, as we already highlighted during the question and answer session. So during the practice anyway, we have to maintain a beginner's mind. So probably you have heard about one interesting book called Beginner's Mind, Zen Mind. So it is quite important to maintain a beginner's mind during the practice. So the practice is very much giving emphasis on to our own experience. So there are 3 levels of panya or wisdom typically explained in the Dhamma. The first one is called Suttame Jnana, Suttame Panya. So what we gather by hearing and by reading, so that is what we call as the Suttame Panya. And it is fairly superficial. We haven't yet understood. Basically it is kind of a copied or borrowed knowledge. So Suttame Jnana in that sense is somewhat superficial. But that is also important. And on the other hand, the second part is called kind of contemplative knowledge, which is called Chintame Prajna. So we do a kind of logical analysis, logical thinking, our own rational thinking within ourselves. That also help us to have a further thorough understanding. So internally we do kind of a mapping, kind of a convincing ourselves, and various information we already have gathered. So I am recognizing all that information, putting things together so that I get a thorough understanding. That is what we call as Chintame Panya. But that is also not enough. So what we are trying to do in a retreat is, most importantly, the third one, that is what we call as Bhavaname Panya, experiential knowledge. So during the meditation session, therefore, we have to start as a beginner. I don't know anything, I am just a beginner, let me see what's going on. So it's always a fresh kind of a mind that we have to maintain during the practice session. So therefore I always request the yogis to maintain that fresh attitude, beginner's mind, when we are sitting or when we are walking. Because when we learn a lot, when we read many books and when we listen to various Dhamma sermons, there is a possibility while meditating, when we are experiencing something, immediately that information can come to the mind. It can overwhelm the mind. It can even hinder our practice. So the practice may evolve as a very natural, slow process, but our previous understandings or previous assumptions, previously gathered knowledge can come to the forefront and hinder our practice. Even though we know a lot, we can't expedite our practice. Since we gather a lot of knowledge, does not mean that quickly, practically, we can go in a fast track. Therefore, we need to come to the ground and to start as a beginner every time, so that we are starting afresh. Say for example, you are keeping your foot on the ground and you are able to recognize certain amount of hardness, certain amount of softness, say heaviness, lightness. All these things are possible to recognize as a direct experience. That is not that difficult. But at that time, if the book knowledge comes in the front and telling, okay, this is this element, this is that element, this is mentioned by this monk, this is mentioned in this particular book. So I think the next stage is this, let me try that one. So likewise, if the book knowledge is interrupting us, trying to overwhelm us, occupy the mind, then that will be a very difficult thing. So we have to, in a way, advise ourselves, just keep it aside, just maintain a beginner's mind, just have a fresh mind, a kind of a childlike mind, so that we can continue our practice in a more smooth, direct manner. So always giving prominence to direct experience is very, very important in a retreat, in a meditation session. Now, having said that, actually we can get into the last two supports, two anuggahitas that Buddha mentioned. That is nothing but the samatha and vipassana. So samatha anuggahita is where we are in a way trying to calm down the mind, relax the mind, and depending on our practice, either to fairly maintain a concentrated mind, focused mind, or to have a kind of a collected mind. So we can discuss that later. So basically, having a peaceful mind, at one level a concentrated mind, calm mind, relaxed mind is very, very important, because otherwise with a scattered mind, a confused mind, we can't understand the teaching. Even though we can superficially understand certain amount of information even with by a confused mind, we can't say merely fully confused. We can say to some extent, we can read and learn and understand to some extent, but particularly in the practice, particularly in the meditative level, we need to have that fair amount of a calm, relaxed, concentrated mind. And the last one is what we call as the vipassana anuggahita, where we have to develop our mind so that we get thorough understanding, we get wisdom. So that development of the wisdom is the last part mentioned in this Anuggahita Sutta, and that is a long-term process. It is not just one thing. So we have to continue that as much as possible within this whole lifetime. So these Anuggahitas or these supports we have to look at like say what we are using in a long journey. Suppose you are in a long journey and time to time you might have to ask the way, ask the path from another person. Sometimes you have to take a rest. Sometimes you have to eat. Sometimes you have to drink some water. Sometimes you have to look at the directions. Sometimes you have to make a sleep. So likewise, various supports are necessary even when we are in a long journey. So we have to decide what is important right now. Am I hungry, or am I need a rest, or do I need to ask from someone else whether my direction is correct? So it depends on our situation. So similarly in the Dhammapada also, we need to see whether we are in the correct mood, our mind is ready to practice, or whether mind is confused, scattered. So accordingly we have to take the proper remedy, proper support. So these supports therefore are quite practical, and we have to apply whatever the support depending on our situation. Now these are the things typically we say in the very first day, so that we understand during the retreat session we have to support in all these 5 ways. In one sense, we are maintaining the morality honestly, and then we are participating in the Dhamma sermon so that we gather some information, gather some teachings from the Buddha's suttas, his teachings. And on the other hand, we are participating in the discussion so that we are directly discussing our experiences, and if we have any doubts, then we are clarifying them. And the fourth is where we are developing certain amount of concentration where it is necessary. And on the other hand, continuously we are practicing vipassana so that our understanding is growing. So this is the model, or this is the architecture that we have to maintain as much as possible. And now we can get into the sutta theme that I have selected for this retreat. So it is actually available in the Satya Sangyutta. You know about the Four Noble Truths. So in that Noble Truth section of the Connected Discourses, Samyutta Nikaya, this sutta is named as Samadhi Sutta. And one occasion, Buddha was residing at Jetanaramaya, and there in the Jeta's grove. So there he addressed the monks and he is telling, Samadhim bhikkhave bhaveta, samahito bhikkhave yatabhutam pajanati. Monks, you need to develop samadhi. And once you have samadhi, your mind is, say, collected, then you are able to understand how things as they truly are. Now, this is a kind of an open statement to what extent we need to develop samadhi, what we call as samadhi. So these are all very interesting questions. So different people, different teachers have different levels of understanding. So let's see in a way what Buddha talks here and what he expects by developing samadhi. Kincha yatabhutang pajanati. Now he say that once you develop concentration, you are able to understand as they truly are. So what is you are going to understand? Kincha yatabhutam pajanati. In what sense that you are understanding as they truly are? Idan dukkhanti yatabhutam pajanati, ayan dukkha samudayoti yatabhutam pajanati, ayan dukkha nirodhoti yatabhutam pajanati, ayan dukkha nirodhagamini patipadati yatabhutam pajanati. So in other words, Buddha is talking about Four Noble Truths. So if you are having that proper samadhi, you are able to understand the First Noble Truth, Second Noble Truth, Third Noble Truth, and the Fourth Noble Truth. So therefore, we are going to discuss Four Noble Truths with respect to concentration, necessary concentration, as well as the Satipatthana practice within this retreat. So basically, what is First Noble Truth? So First Noble Truth, typically we call it as Idan Dukkhang. So there is suffering, there is, say, unsatisfactoriness. So let me take you to a little bit of practice before we get into a deep philosophical understanding about the Four Noble Truths. Let's get into some practice-related environment. Now suppose you are practicing Anapanasati. You are practicing mindfulness on breathing. So one sense is that we start in a way, okay, I am practicing meditation, I am practicing Anapanasati. So this is how we typically start. But as we progress, we may allow breathing to happen naturally. Then we step back or have a little distance, and then we allow the body to naturally breathe, and then we look at, oh, this is in-breath, this is out-breath, this is in-breath, this is out-breath. So you can see objectively now we are looking at. It is not that I am breathing, I am understanding. Rather, we can say the body is breathing, so understanding is there, observation is there. There is breathing, there is in-breath, there is out-breath. So there's a significant difference in the perspective. At one sense, at the beginning we started like I am breathing or I am meditating. But later, when we are properly aligned, we can say, okay, in-breath happens, out-breath happens. It doesn't belong to anyone. It doesn't belong to me. It is merely in-breath. It is merely out-breath. Now say you are walking. During the walking, as we discussed during the question and answer session, sometimes we come to this kind of a very beautiful balance. So we allow the body to naturally walk. So I am not purposefully changing anything, deliberately interfering anything. It is not necessary to adjust anything. Now body has found its beautiful balance. And you are able to look at it objectively. So it is not that I am walking, but we can say it's the body walking. And steps are properly touching the ground, and each step generates certain amount of sensation, and now you are looking at it objectively. There is a sensation, there is hardness, there is softness, there is heat, there is cold, there is weight, there is lightness. So likewise they become a kind of way of looking at whatever a process more in an objective manner. Not I get involved in a subjective manner, rather we are looking at it in a more objective manner. So this is quite important during the whole Satipatthana practice, as well as the way Buddha is presenting the Four Noble Truths. So in the Four Noble Truths, so in the first statement, idang dukkhang, so there is suffering. So it has to be aligned with the Buddha's teaching, so that indicates in the Satipatthana also we have to align with the same approach. It is not that I am meditating or I am breathing or I am walking, rather there is walking or there is left, there is right, or even if you go a little deeper, there is hardness, there is softness, there is movements, there are vibrations. So likewise we are keeping them in the proper perspective. That is very, very important. Now, in the Dukkha Satya, the first noble truth, there are actually 3 stages that we need to take care of. Actually, it is common to each and every truth. It's a kind of a model that Buddha is coming across. So each and every truth has 3 aspects. First aspect is called as the pariyatti, what we call as a kind of a theoretical explanation about what it is, pariyatti. And the second is what we call as the patipatti or patipada, where what we need to do according to understand that particular truth. And as a result of that patipada, that practice, what we have understood is the third aspect, what we call as the pativeda. So these 3 aspects are common to each and every noble truth. So 3 into 4 becomes as 12, what we call as dvadasakara. Probably you have heard this in the Four Noble Truths. It is explained in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, dvadasakara. The 12 aspects altogether comes 3 aspects for each and every noble truth. Now, if we take today the first noble truth, so what is suffering? So mundane way we can all understand, okay, there is suffering when we get sick. There is suffering when there's a headache, when there's a stomach ache. So there is suffering when there is heat, too much heat. Likewise, there are very easy to understand level of suffering, and there are certain deep level of understand suffering as well. So sometimes Buddha talks about 3 categories of suffering, what we call as dukkha dukkha, viparinama dukkha, and sankhara dukkha. Dukkha dukkha. Typically, whenever there is a disease, kind of an illness, a discomfort, it naturally involves certain amount of suffering, kind of a pain we can say, a painful feeling. It may have certain amount of discomfort. But on the other hand, if we add top of that, so I am suffering, why it is happening to me, why this body is sick, when it is going to get well, so I have to participate on a party tomorrow, when I am going to be well. So many other things I can add to the picture. Now I am suffering too much. Additionally also now I am suffering apart from the natural bodily suffering. So natural bodily suffering and various other kinds of suffering that is causing bodily suffering actually is one part, but on top of that we are adding more mental suffering as well. And on the other hand, we might have expected something, but we understood, okay, it has evolved, it has become old. So I expected kind of youth within myself, okay, now the body has become old, aged, decayed. But whenever we see that kind of a change, kind of maybe unexpected change or kind of undesired kind of change, so then kind of a suffering also happens, because I didn't expect that kind of a change. Now probably you have heard about maybe kind of economic crisis, maybe war situations, maybe someone meeting with an accident, or all of a sudden maybe petrol prices have been hiked. So things can change overnight. So probably say a airplane being delayed, or cancelled, your trip being cancelled, you are being given a promise but that person turned back. So many things have happened, changes have happened. So when these changes happen, it can also produce fair amount of suffering, because we expected in a particular way, particular manner, but the situation didn't happen in the same way that I expected. It has changed. The way it has changed. So in that sense, so this viparinama dukkha actually have unavoidable situation, because things are always changing, constantly changing, but I am expecting in a certain way of behavior. When my expectation and that behavior doesn't tally properly in line, then actually I am going to suffer. So is it really necessary to suffer? Can't we accept the change? So these are very interesting things to discuss. So why am I suffering? Viparinama dukkha. So due to the evolution, due to the change, unexpected different kinds of changes. So is it necessary to suffer? Is it necessary to worry? Is it necessary to cry? Is it necessary to accept the situation? Is it possible to adjust to the situation? Can I have a kind of a flexibility to adjust to the situation? So viparinama dukkha. Now the last one is the most important and very interesting one, what we call as the sankhara dukkha. Where due to the formations, fabrications happens within our mind, we create further suffering. So whenever a little mental image happens in the mind, without simply allowing it to fade away, I do various fabrications onto it. I am attributing a person to it. I am adding my own stuff. I am adding my own likes and dislikes into the picture and prepare something. So that preparation, that fabrication, that fantasizing, all these actually makes that whatever the minimal kind of information into huge thing, a huge emotion, and now I am suffering. So likewise, we don't know how to allow things to happen naturally without putting our hand, so that I am unnecessarily participating, unnecessarily fabricating, unnecessary conditioning, interrupting, but ultimately I am the one going to suffer. So all these sankharas, all these fabrications, all these interruptions, knowingly or unknowingly that I am conducting, participating, ultimately causing me to suffer. So likewise, in a way, more broader manner, we can divide the whole suffering into three groups. First one is what we call as the dukkha dukkha, where painful feelings and say bodily suffering, illnesses, such kind of suffering, mostly unavoidable. And on top of that, we add in the mental part that can be avoided. And then the viparinama dukkha, constantly things are changing, but I am unable to accept it. My expectation is one thing, but how the things have changed is quite different. So I am going to suffer. So that is viparinama dukkha. But that also we can minimize in a way. And the last one is the sankhara dukkha, where I do a lot of manipulations. I am trying to do a lot of manipulations. I am trying to do a lot of constructions. I am trying to do a lot of preparations. Trying to do various, my own kind of intrusions into the picture. And ultimately I am the one going to suffer. Sankhara dukkha. And when I am talking like this, so probably it may be convinced that fair amount of suffering can be minimized, because there's a significant participation that I do for my own suffering. But if I am developing myself, the suffering has to be reduced, it has to be minimized. So therefore, Buddha's teaching helping us to minimize suffering. It is, even though Buddha talks frequently about suffering, and the First Noble Truth is very much about suffering, but the result or the direction is not the suffering, but the minimizing of suffering, or to be happy, to be joyful. And now if we go another direction, if we discuss another direction, other direction is, so what is the another depth of suffering, or what we call as the typical suffering, as we just discussed, say due to unavoidable situations, unexpected situations, what I expected didn't happen the way I want. I want certain way of things to happen, but it didn't happen that way. And when I am getting sick, I am being suffering. So likewise, the very kind of easy to understand level of suffering that Buddha mentioned, that is also there. Jati dukkha, jara dukkha, marana dukkha, soka parideva dukkha. So likewise, various levels of suffering is mentioned. But on the other hand, most important as practitioners is the last one, what we call as the sankittena panchupadanakkhandha dukkha. So dukkha satcha sometimes concisely mentioned as nothing but panchupadanakkhandha tissa vachaniyam. So what is dukkha satcha? What is the noble truth of suffering? Nothing but a synonym for the 5 grasping aggregates. Now, 5 grasping aggregates, in that sense, we have to consider deeply. Now, first noble truth, as I mentioned, has 3 aspects. Kind of a theoretical stuff, and how we need to operate on that, that is the practice. And then, as a result of the practice, what we need to understand. So, 3 aspects. According to the first noble truth, Buddha mentioned, okay, what is suffering, what is dukkha satcha, theoretical point of view. I have given certain amount of explanation now. So, birth is suffering, change is suffering, what I want, not receiving that is suffering, getting old is suffering, aging is suffering, getting sick is suffering. So likewise, the basic thing is there. And on top of that, I have the last one, just I mentioned, that is the panchupadanakkhandha tissa vachaniyam. So that means the 5 grasping aggregates are suffering. So this is theoretical still. We are still touching the theory part. So 5 grasping groups, so 5 grasping aggregates. So what are they? So probably you have heard about it, right? So 5 grasping aggregates. Rupa upadanakkhandha, Vedana upadanakkhandha, Sanya upadanakkhandha, Sankhara upadanakkhandha, Vijnana upadanakkhandha. So theoretically we know, okay, these are the upadanakkhandha or 5 grasping aggregates. Form aggregate, feeling aggregate, perceptions aggregate, formations aggregate, and the consciousness aggregate. And when we are grasping that, we call them as grasping aggregate. Now, that is also still theory. So, how are we going to understand? The second aspect about the First Noble Truth talks about that. So, just mere theoretical understanding is not Buddha emphasized here. Buddha says, so this First Noble Truth has to be understood. Idan dukkhaṃ ariya sacchaṃ pariññeyaṃ. So the term pariññeyaṃ refers a thorough understanding. Thorough understanding of the suffering. It is not that we are immediately trying to get rid of suffering, but Buddha invites us to thoroughly understand suffering. So Buddha, in that sense, kind of make a revolutionary invitation. Okay, rather than you immediately going to be happy, first of all, try to understand what is suffering. What's the problem? So, particularly, here we are talking about the 5 aggregates, 5 grasping groups. So, that has to be understood. So, the first grasping group or grasping aggregate, form aggregate. So that is also we can say, okay, different images are there, or rather, say different physical things are there, say clock is there, houses are there, vehicles are there, all are physical. So are we going to look at them in that point of view? Are we going to do a scientific analysis so that like scientists we are going to have thorough understanding about the materiality? Or Buddha talks differently. So the form aggregate. So form aggregate. So how are we going to understand the form aggregate? Now, say today, even more than the Buddha's time, so people have understood the materiality, isn't it? So scientists have gone to very far to understand the physical things. So they know better, say how many particles are there, how many atoms are there, how many neutrons, protons are there. So are we going to take the same approach to understand the form aggregate? Is that the Buddha expected from us? Or Buddha look at it from a different angle? So whenever we are trying to understand whatever the aggregate, so it has to give kind of a dispassion within ourselves. Rather than we are adding too many information, not information, we can say labels and concepts and occupying our mind. Rather we have to have a kind of a dispassion and fair amount of understanding, and that understanding has to lead to a kind of a release in the mind. So therefore, it is not mere scientific investigation that we are trying to do. Certain scientific approaches is there, but the way we are looking at always have to give us kind of a dispassion, detachment in our mind as a result of this experiment, as a result of this kind of a research in a way. So that is why when Buddha is defining the form aggregate, so Buddha say, okay, this is very weak. This body is very weak. Even a mosquito bite can make it sick. Even the temperature change can make it sick. Even the heat change, it makes it sick. Nowadays, there's a significant heat wave going on, I think, in India. So many people even died. So that means even heat change can make a drastic change. Can't bear it. And even a serpent bite, snake bite can make it difficult. We're going to suffer. So likewise, Buddha's definition, it is not mere scientific in a way. It is not mere materialistic kind of investigation. Rather, Buddha giving a different approach. So by looking at it, so you rather than become materially enthusiastic about it, rather you become dispassionate about it. So what is this going on? So that type of an approach is in a way very important. So when we are practicing also, we need to look at, even when we are practicing on the form aggregate, we have to have that kind of a dispassionate attitude as we are developing. So in order to understand the form aggregate, the practice what we are doing is what we call as the Kayanupassana. So Kayanupassana is the practical approach that we are taking in order to understand the form aggregate. So we are very much grounding ourselves, developing certain amount of Samadhi, and trying to understand this very body, what we call as internal body, so that we get a thorough understanding about the materiality. So it is not that we are looking outside, finding out various protons and neutrons and whatever things in the outside using a microscope or using a sophisticated instrument. Rather, we are using our own mindfulness, on certain amount of concentration, using which we are trying to understand within this very body. So what is this matter? What is these physical things? What are the form aggregate? So a kind of a simplified version is given by the Buddha himself. That is nothing but 4 elements. So the first 4 elements is a simplified way of looking at it. We don't have to look at the, all the matter, what we found today, but we can simplify our understanding. Just nothing but just 4 elements are there. So otherwise you have to, memorize all the parameters, how many molecules are there. So you don't need to go take that approach. Rather, Buddha has given a very easy to understand type of looking at it. Nothing but 4 elements are there. A simple way of categorization. So the first element, what we call as the earth element, which has certain kind of characteristics. We all heard about it. Hardness, softness, heaviness, lightness, then the roughness, smoothness. So these are very primitive kind of characteristics we can come across, whatever physical. And then if we consider the other element, say water element, what is flowing and kind of cohesion. So these are the very primitive characteristics available. And then the vibrations, movements, these are the very primitive characteristics available in the air element. And then the heat element, it's quite obvious, heat and the cold. So these are very fundamental level of understanding what we can attribute to every physical thing. It is a very common thing. It is not, you don't need very sophisticated instruments to understand this. What you need is a fairly focused mind. You have to have a mindful attitude. You can't simply do it in a distracted manner. You need to maintain your attention consistently, fairly concentrated, and then obviously the body will show its own natural characteristics. Because this body is made up with all these four elements, so constantly it is showing those element characteristics. So why we can't understand it is because our mind is fairly distracted. And we haven't even looked at it from that angle. And that's why Most Venerable Matara Sri Jnanarama Mahathero advised, the yogi has to understand the language of the elements. So we may understand English, we may understand Tamil, we may understand Sinhalese, but we need to now understand another language, that is the language of the elements. So elements may come forward and show their characteristics, and we need to know what are the characteristics, and now we are fairly recognizing those characteristics. So while walking, say your foot is touching the ground and you recognize hardness. Now we need to understand, the earth element is talking. Something like that. When you recognize, say, heat, probably now you can understand, the heat element is talking. Now you recognize, say, cold, you understand, the heat element is talking. Tejo Dhatu. Now movements are happening, constantly movements are happening. Vibrations are happening. So you can understand, the air element is talking. It is the most prominent characteristic available. So likewise, when you are looking at it in that angle, now still you are very much like understanding its nature. Practically. It is not through the book. Now I am just talking, it's merely still superficial, it's just a book knowledge. But you need to understand practically while you are walking, while you are sitting, all these characteristics within this very body. So therefore, understanding all these characteristics directly is important. That's why this First Noble Truth talk about the pariññayang, understanding. First, Buddha talks about the theoretical understanding. Now we are talking about the practical understanding. So practically also we need to understand how it behaves like, how it tastes like, how it changes like. So all these things are possible only when, in one sense, we need to first of all understand what is earth element. Theoretical understanding. We need to understand what is this air element, what is this heat element. So a certain amount of theoretical understanding is necessary. But once that is available, we need to focus our attention, then only we can extract then only we can perceive these different characteristics. Otherwise we can't even recognize them. Because our mind is fairly scattered. I don't have that amount of focused attention. So that's why at the initial stages, having certain amount of focused attention is very, very important. Because these different characteristics are constantly changing throughout the body. Looking at them as an overview is one way of looking at it. But thoroughly to understand their nature, their behavior, I need to focus to a particular area, particular place, so that I can thoroughly see its true nature. It's a kind of an experiment in a way. But the apparatus what we are using is the mindfulness and the concentration. So how much of concentration we need to do this? So that is in a way we need to look at. So what we need to look at is a certain amount of hardness, softness, say vibrations, movements, and all these different element characteristics happening within the mind. Do I have the necessary amount of concentration to do it? If I don't have it, then I need to develop, isn't it? Now, these are very subtle characteristics. So while you are sitting, certain amount of characteristics are already available. But in order to focus your attention constantly for long time there, so that you can thoroughly understand its nature, is a kind of a prerequisite that we need to do, that we need to acquire. It's very much like you are using a microscope. So in order to do a kind of a proper analysis, you need to have a very balanced apparatus, precise apparatus, fault-free apparatus, and then only you can look at it. Same approach here. Say we are developing certain amount of mindfulness, and as a result of developing mindfulness, now you gather certain amount of concentration. Your mind is now constantly or fair amount of time, you are capable of keeping it fairly focused. As a result of that, that focused mind is capable of understanding what's really going on in that particular place. So in order to have this proper balance, it may take time. I can talk it within a short time, but in order to mentally achieve it, it takes a long time. So that is why we have to work hard. Because proper alignment. So it is easy to properly align a microscope, but properly aligning our mind to each and every phenomena when they are occurring actually needs a certain amount of skill. It's a mental skill. Say for example, while you are walking, say your right foot is touching the ground, now you need to properly aim your attention onto that right foot. When your left foot is touching the ground, you have to properly aim your attention properly to that particular place. If your aiming is wrong, then you can't properly comprehend what is really going on there. And on the other hand, the timing is also important. Assume that before your foot touches the ground, I put my attention there, but when it is touching the ground, my mind get distracted. Then my timing is not proper. So it has to be properly timed, properly aimed, and I have to have a very balanced mind. Then only I am able to understand what's really going on there. So how are we going to develop them? These skills. So that's why we have to walk. In a way, the walking meditation is giving us that kind of a exercise. So through that exercise, mental exercise, we are internally developing all these skills. Properly aiming our mind very quickly to a particular phenomena so that I am able to understand what's going on there. I am investigating what's going on there. It is not merely keeping our mind in a superficial manner, but I have to have a penetrative look, investigative attitude in order to look at what's really going on there. Something like that. Quite scientific, isn't it? So, when we are continuing, now say if we are practicing Vedananupassana, say different feelings, bodily feelings are available. Typically what happens is whenever there is a physical pleasurable feeling, we like it, I want to have it tomorrow, how I am going to keep it. So these are the typical way we approach. But how are we going to have a very balanced feeling to it? Say when there is a pleasurable feeling, am I able to look at it objectively as we just discussed? This is a pleasurable feeling. It is not that I am happy, I am pleased, I am elated, or I am quite joyful. Rather, there is a pleasurable feeling. When there is a painful feeling, why it is happening to me, why it is me and others are doing well, why am I suffering? Rather doing that way, there is a painful feeling. So look and see, idang dukkhang ariya satchang. So there is a painful feeling. So we have to have that objective attitude, that proper perspective. So when we are having that, so assume that there is a painful feeling there. Now you are keeping your attention there and looking at it. trying to understand through it. So the painful feeling is very much like a teacher. Rather than I want to get rid of it, now it is very much like they are to teach me. Now I am looking at it objectively, it is changing whatever the way. Now I am observing it carefully so that understanding is growing within the mind. And there may be a equanimous feeling rather than feeling ignorant about it. So I need to look at it also carefully. So assume that there are certain thoughts available in the mind. So rather than being driven by thoughts, so I should be able to look at them also in an objective manner. So that is why Buddha talks that in the Chittanupassana level, when there is a lustful thought, so you are looking at it, oh, there is a lustful thought. When there is a, say, hateful thought, there is a hateful thought. It is not that I hate you or why he did to me, something like that. Rather, there is a hateful thought. So, in order to come to this level, you can see, fair amount of practice is required. It is not that immediately we can achieve all these capabilities or skills. So, that's why we are developing this way of proper looking at things, objective looking at things, from the scratch in a way. From our breath, from our walk, from our step. So it's a kind of a training. It has a huge benefit. As we are moving forward, we have to carry this way of looking at things to the very subtle levels. So while body is touching the ground, when your foot is touching the ground, so you are looking at it properly, objectively, maintaining that proper distance, like someone else's touch, like someone else's foot, like someone else's pain, like someone else's pleasurable feeling. So same approach now we have to even take to the mind when there is a thought, oh, this is a thought, this is a lustful thought, this is a negative thought, or this is a, say, happy thought, a joyful thought. So you are looking at it in a more objective manner. So there is suffering. It is not that I suffer, but there is suffering. So you can see in the Satipatthana, so the first Satipatthana, Kayanupassana, help us to understand the first aggregate, what we call as the form aggregate. Then the Vedananupassana help us to understand, in one sense, again about the form aggregate, because the bodily feelings, and again the feeling aggregate. And later probably we are understanding the feelings happen in the mind. And then with the Chittanupassana, we are trying to understand the consciousness aggregate, and again certain amount of feelings and certain amount of perceptions. And in the Dhammanupassana, we are actually touching all 5 aggregates. So likewise, all Satipatthanas in that sense is a thorough experiment that we are doing on 5 aggregates. Even though we start with very simple practices, it is taking us to a more deeper, thorough, subtle understanding about the 5 aggregates. Especially when we are starting with the Kayanupassana, if we are touching particularly about the elements, so that is where we carefully, thoroughly trying to understand the form aggregate with their very basic primordial elements, constructs. And when we do the Vedananupassana, that is where we are understanding all these different feelings, so that feelings are the very basic constituents of the feeling aggregate. Different feelings are there, so we are looking at them. And say thoughts are there, other various, say, defilements, we can call them various names. And there we are trying to understand the formations aggregate, perceptions aggregate, consciousness aggregate, all that. So the Satipatthana practice in that sense gives us a very practical approach to understand the first noble truth. And we'll discuss maybe tomorrow how it is connecting to the second noble truth. And today I just want to give a fair introduction and kind of an initiation of this sutta. And with that, I'd like to conclude today's Dhamma sermon. Thank you very much for attentive listening.